Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host, minister, and friend, Chino Ross, pastor and the voice of the Understanding Scripture and Truth by Chino D. Ross YouTube channel. Chino, it's good to be back. I'll warn the audience ahead of time. I'm getting over a cold or something, so I'm not sure how long my voice is going to last, but I do have it right now, so I can.
Well, I'm glad you're over there and I'm over here.
I'm sure you are. It's not as much fun as that sounded, but you have had quite a bit of fun from what I understand. We have these episodes queued ahead of time. We've recorded, I don't know how many, 5 or 6 ahead, and we record every week, but this will go out long after this event has happened. But you've received all kinds of stuff from the desk of Hobart Freeman, and I'm a little excited to get into that and go through that, because I'm certain you're going to find things that researchers for years, decades, have not been able to really understand. All of the keys to his kingdom are now in your hands, and I'm a little excited to go through that.
Yeah, imagine my surprise, John, when I pulled up to my house. It was one day last week. Actually, I think it was the day after we recorded last week. And I can see sitting up on my front porch some boxes, and I was expecting them. Someone said, "I've got some stuff I'm going to send you." But we live on a hay farm. It's a long quarter-mile driveway off the main road, up our drive. We sit up on the top of a hill, the driveway to the house. I can see that, yes, it definitely did arrive, and it was a couple of boxes, and I'm supposed to get several more tomorrow, which contain not photocopies, not someone else's notes of Hobart's sermons as he preached, but Dr. Freeman's own actual sermon notes, every single one of them.
Wow.
He typed a lot of his stuff. He did write in the margin. Some of them are handwritten, but I just sent you one little shot of just one. I guess it's just the bottom half of one page of some notes, if you'd like to show that to everyone. So here's what it looks like. I mean, here is what we've just seen. Here's some more sermons. Hobart's got all kinds of writing in red in the margins. I will say one thing about Dr. Freeman. He has absolutely beautiful handwriting. My handwriting is terrible. You can barely read it.
Yeah, mine too.
But from his letters I used to get from him, I remembered he had good handwriting, and you can definitely see that in all of his notes. I mean, he just has exquisite handwriting. So I'll give him props for that. Most of his sermons were typed up, but there's one example here that we just saw, and I just pulled. This was actually in the very top folder. There's a lot of folders in these boxes. They're all bound up. They've got rubber bands around them, and then you dig through them, and they all have titles to them. And I'm talking about his seminary classroom notes. I'm talking about when he was a professor at Grace Seminary, all the classes that he taught, his notes that he used for those classes, his notes that he used for things teaching around the church at Faith Assembly, all of the sermons. Now, if it was just, let's just say, kind of an ad lib sermon on faith or healing, he might not have that all written down in a formal piece of paper. But all the rest of these series are definitely typed out or written out. He did a legendary series. Everyone who followed Faith Assembly will remember the series that he did of about a dozen messages entitled Deeper Discernment and Deliverance. And it was the worst psychobabble, garbage and nonsense. I don't mind calling it that. It is absolutely ridiculous. It's all about how you could possibly have let demons into your life. He talks a lot about the child-centered home, the woman-run home. He talks about the man being Dagwood, who is at the bottom of the totem pole in his family, and such things. But in this, what we just saw, it said the child is happy. He's easygoing at school and at home. But have you noticed over the years? I mean, he has it all in shorthand, but this is what the notes said that you have just put up. Whenever we go out to eat, sulks, moody. You have to make him get out of the car and go in. He's not hungry. But then he runs ahead and grabs the best seat. And then he becomes picky about his food. And then he complains. And the same behavior happens when company comes over. I mean, I remember this very sermon that he preached. All people have to do is go back and find these deeper deliverance and discernment sermons, messages, and they'll know, oh, I remember exactly when he gave this little story. Said, if you discipline and over discipline and years of maturity, if this behavior doesn't change, then you are probably dealing with a spirit. Somewhere, somehow, through television, which he has a red star by, something opened the doors to the spirits, spirit of selfishness, spirit of attention, spirit of rebellion, spirit of torment. He said, most people don't know how to cope with this. The psychologist will say it's a problem child, and they'll say, don't punish, don't bribe the child. Don't punish the child, but rather bribe him. Say this to the child: if you will eat your food, if you'll, I'll let you stay up and watch TV whenever we get home. I'll let you have some Cokes. And that spirit not only remains undetected, but unmolested, because the spirit enjoys the TV mayhem and Cokes.
You know, I grew up in a world that was controlled by evil demons. Whenever the preacher would preach, or we listened to a lot of the recordings of Branham, but sometimes we'd hear preachers preach and they would talk about this evil world that we lived in, and they would call it Satan's Eden. That was the code word for there's devils everywhere. Be scared, man, be scared. And I grew up in that world, and it really impacts every aspect of your life, because you feel no protection. All you're thinking about are the demons around the corner, and you might accidentally catch one if you're not careful. And then to further complicate it, this is so widespread. This is not just limited to these cults. These cults have influenced even mainstream Christianity to a large degree. And you can see it in the comment feeds. Whenever I make comments like the one I'm about to make now, I'll get some hate mail for it. But we went, after leaving the cult, we went to a quote unquote normal Baptist church. I'm not going to give the name. I'll try to disconnect as much as I can. But right after leaving this cult where we're trained and manipulated to be scared of everything, they held this big seminar in the gymnasium talking about exactly what you're reading, talking about all of the demons and how they operate. And demons they would get real quiet up next to the mic. Demons can talk to each other without you knowing it. And that's how they spread what their knowledge they have about your innermost secrets of your life. And it'll get all the way to Satan, and he'll command the legions to come down and get you. I mean, it was, looking back, it's horrific that they did this to our minds. But this was after the cult. And so my perception immediately after leaving was that this was a normal thing. And that perception stayed with me for a long time. But we tried a variety of different churches, and I recommend anybody who's in one of these things, when you escape, try many different churches, because that way you get the whole picture of what is Christianity rather than a one-sided view. I started to realize that the church that we escaped from was manipulating our heads in the same way that the church that we escaped to was manipulating our heads. And then I'm like, well, what do we do now? Are all churches evil? And that thought goes through your head. You have to be very careful. And it all comes back to exactly what you're reading from these notes. They want to scare you and think that they are the protector of all evil.
It's going to take me a long while, I'm sure, to get through Freeman's notes. You just will not believe it's thousands of pages, and I've just barely begun to try to process. But I know one thing that I think I can say this up front, and I barely even opened the first two folders. I don't think, honestly, John, I don't think I'm going to find anything new. I don't think I'm going to find anything surprising, simply because I've heard all the messages and I know where he's coming from. But if one thing you will see, I'm pretty sure, in the notes, because I could tell from his teaching and the little bit that I've looked in these folders, it's definitely true. He has his sermons crafted out. They're all in shorthand, but they're crafted out. They actually have paper clipped onto them which newspaper article or magazine article he wants to reference. And then he also has where he wants to insert a joke. And then he has out beside that, listen to this, har, 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 HRR, HRR, HRR. That's his cue to himself, tell the joke so he can get a response. And I knew that. You can tell that from listening to the tapes. But I think the people there, the poor people there who were under this for all those years, they literally thought he was the mouthpiece of God. And these are the oracles of God being spoken. And when you can break it down and see it from a human perspective, and when you can look at his notes and see where he has this little thing scribbled in and this one marked out, and be sure to tell this joke, it just humanizes all of it. Someone said to me the other day, since we did our last podcast, a new person that I talked to, John, said, "Hey, I noticed you rarely ever call him Dr. Freeman. You call him Hobart or Freeman." And I said, that's true. And I said, I did it on purpose. Not that I have a problem calling him Dr. Freeman. He has an earned THD degree. An earned doctorate degree is a difficult thing to get. If you've earned the degree, you earn to be called doctor. I have no problem with that at all. I've actually got two of my children who are adult, two of my five. I have 5 children. 2 of them have earned doctorates, one in education and one in accounting. Now, they don't insist that I call them doctor, but if they did, I probably would. Because, you're super proud of someone, especially a child of yours who's become an adult and has an earned doctorate degree. And I have a daughter-in-law who has an earned medical degree. So she's a doctor in the medical world. So I said, it's not because I don't believe in calling him Dr. Freeman. I just call him Hobart or Freeman because I just want to humanize him, not demonize him. I just want to humanize him, that he's a man that studied the Bible, that came up with ideas, that wrote down notes, that drove to church, that preached a sermon, and went back home and did it all over again, just like any other minister does. He was not a prophet, and he was not the mouthpiece for God. So, yeah, this is better than King Tut's tomb, I think, what has been delivered on my front porch. And I really appreciate the people out there. We've got a lot of really good people following your podcast, John, and following this section of them since they're very interested in Hobart Freeman. Well, last time we were talking about corporal punishment. And, right after we did the corporal punishment one, which hasn't even aired yet, the Child of Faith Assembly Facebook page, the next day had this post on there. Someone said, "My father whipped his 5 boys. What were the results? I left home at the age of 13 and never looked back. 2 of my brothers died of substance abuse problems. My other 2 brothers tried raising their kids the way he did, and as adults, none of their kids speak to them. Lesson learned, it is normal to hate people who hurt you." And one of the comments that someone put on really struck home because it goes back to Bruce Kinsey days. And Bruce had a meeting over near Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. This person said, "We went to the Lafayette body, which at one time was a converted bowling alley. The hallway behind the lanes was the spanking room. Children were being spanked because we couldn't sit still in a 3 to 4 hour church service, if you want to call what happened spanking." So, That's just unsolicited testimony that had nothing to do with our podcast, because it was done before you and I ever spoke last week. But this was a movement that was motivated by fear. They were taught through legalism. It produced bondage. They thought they had discovered all the little tricks and gimmicks and shortcuts and incantations, any hocus pocus that could bring you to a deeper walk with God. But as we continue to stress, this is just not biblical Christianity. Biblical Christianity is based on biblical theology. It's based on biblical truth. It involves a personal walk in relationship with God. It involves a change of the inner man. And this long history we have in American evangelicalism of legalisms, of the holiness cults, has probably done more damage than it has done good. And maybe the ministers meant well. I think they might could look out in their congregation and maybe wish they had seen some more spirituality. But, you know, John, in every church, you're going to have all different levels and groups of people. We all would like to be a part of something pure, quote unquote, but we're not pure. So as soon as we join it, the purity's been messed up right there. We'd like to see everybody just super spiritual and hungry for God and reading their Bible and praying and turned on to serving the Lord. But you're just going to have, because that's just human nature, and that's the nature of a local group of Christians, you're going to have people at different stages of their walk. There were all kinds of people at all kinds of levels, and there was freedom and love and joy and acceptance and excitement over what the next week and the next day was going to bring in their Christian life. My goodness, by the time we get to the early 80s in the New Faith Assembly building, I mean, everybody's in a straitjacket. Everybody marches to the same beat. They all look the same, speak the same, talk the same, act the same, dress the same. And Hobart had encouraged that. 1 Corinthians 1:10 was their motto that they had up front in the building, painted on the wall, that there cannot be any divisions among us. We must all speak the same thing, and so forth, what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1:10. But as I've said before, you have to leave that up to the Holy Spirit to bring that about. And it's an ideal situation that we are going to definitely strive for, but it's not something that we are going to arrive at. This is just not the way Christianity works. So then the last thing that we talked about in the previous interview, John, was I'm trying to work my way chronologically from when the child is born. You know, you spank the daylights out of him, and the dad's at the top and the mom and the kids are down at the bottom. Then when you get 5 and 6 and 8 and 9 years old, this was not something I ever heard Hobart say, but it was something that another minister, if not several other ministers, taught, and that is that little boys and girls were not allowed to play together. And I asked you last time, do you know why they were not allowed to play together? And I don't want to put you on the spot, so I'll fill in the answer: because they might actually rub up against each other. And you know, we still laugh when we even hear that, don't we?
It's so messed up, man.
It is messed up. 8 and 9 year old children. I mean, they didn't want them to touch against each other because maybe touching would lead to rubbing or something. Oh my word. Oh my word. I remember in the Facebook group also, that's a Facebook group that has posts, John, that go back 16, 18 years ago. And I have read every one of those posts. Some of them have as many as 50 comments, and I've read every single comment more than once. And after saying what I said last week about little boys and girls, I do remember seeing comments made by adult women now who said that there was a minister or ministers that gave them the creeps back in the day, that wanted them to sit on their lap, or wanted to just, I don't know, snuggle a little bit too much. I mean, I didn't say this. I'm just reporting what other adults have said. It's from their past. And it's all public. It's on a public Facebook page. They said he gave us the creeps, or they gave us the creeps. And my dad didn't allow him to come back to our house anymore. So, I mean, there is something there. I don't think maybe it wasn't a huge issue at Faith Assembly, but for someone to do this psychological projecting and be talking about little boys and girls, doing, let's don't let them play together because we don't know what that might lead to. We want to protect them. There's something there. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'd like to turn this over to someone who has a specialist in this field, and they could probably get to the bottom of things that we don't want to hear about.
They'd probably take one look at the whole thing and say, this is just messed up. All of it's messed up. From every aspect trains you in the wrong way, from parenthood to Christianity to more. In the Branham cults, the women, there was this doctrine that came out in the 60s that women were the root of all evil. And you mentioned that in the last episode. You're talking about Hobart talking about how women were behind every evil deed that happened or whatever. That was Branhamism 101. Branham used to he used to get in front of crowds with these papers of statistics, and I don't know where he got them. In fact, I don't think they were real statistics. I think he just made them up for the show. But he would say, out of every crime that happens in the United States, every one of them, there's a woman behind it. We have statistics here. And he would hold them up, and you're like, where'd you get that, man? That's not how that works. But the doctrine was such that the women were the root of all evil, and he took it straight back to the Garden of Eden and claimed that like I said, the woman wasn't in the original creation. But he took it further. I don't know if I mentioned this in the last episode. He said that women were designed by Satan, not by God, to deceive men into sex. And that's all literally, that's all they were created for. Towards the end of his life, this was a doctrine. And so, I know some of the old timers that didn't agree with that, and you can talk to them today, but as a male growing up in it, and listening to this thing and thinking that it's true, you're like, oh my gosh, they're out to get me. I have hormones. And that's how every man is that's growing up in this. And then I don't know that we had it to the level that you're talking about, that the girls and the boys couldn't be together, but there were certainly some freaks among the ministers that had some weird things about the girls and the boys. And I too question whether it was a result of the doctrines or whether they had a psychological issue. Or could be that there's somebody in the crowd that they know is really messed up, and maybe they are trying to protect people. I don't know. But the whole thing is just so odd that I think a psychologist would look at it and say, well, I think, to be honest, we just need like 30 or 40 padded rooms, and let's just put a bunch of them in it.
Oh, yeah, I think we need to shut this religion down and scrub it all and start all over again. I don't know what parts of Hobart Freeman's views about women came from Branham and what parts just came from, he was a Depression era child. He came from a different generation. He was in a family of, nothing but sisters, and there were a lot of them. I don't really know where it all originated, but we know that there are connections between Hobart and William Branham. And so it does make you wonder. I know he was listening to a lot of what Branham had to say. Now, he never said anything as extreme as what you just said, that Branham said what the purpose of women was, but the thrust of his message about male and female relationships almost started to go down that path. It was definitely heavily male dominated. And he would use verses for that, and I understand that. But even beyond the verses, it just seemed like that was something that was coming to him pretty naturally anyway. So speaking of hormones, let's graduate from 8 and 9 years old to now we're into the teenage years. And this is a John Collins show, not a Howard Stern show. So we have to be very careful what we say. But Hobart outlawed dating. And that became, dating was not allowed at Faith Assembly. They would just give all of these warnings, and there are warnings. I always want to say there are warnings in Scripture to avoid youthful lusts and to flee fornication. And those warnings are there because we as Christian people obviously need those warnings, and that's what God has given to us in the Bible. But the way that they would go about it, John, there's so much legislation involved and so much legalism involved that it just came to be way out of balance. Everything, Hobart would say that he always called the invention of the automobile, that was something terrible. And he said he always called the automobile the mobile bedroom, the mobile bedroom. So he was really big on things like that. But everything that came from Faith Assembly was so spooky and so guilt-ridden. And so, as you just said a moment ago, I mean, I'm 60, almost 66 years old. So it's a little harder at my age to put myself back when I was 16 and 17. But what you just said is so true. Teenagers have hormones that are raging, and they're supposed to be. You know, they're not raging at my age like they were raging when I was 15 and 16 and 17 years old. And so it does no good to deny that the hormones are there, which is almost what Faith Assembly would do. You know, we just need to be it's, not males or females, just it's, robots. You know, we've got to deny these hormones. They wouldn't say let's deny hormones, but I'm just saying the way they put pressure on the young people to stay away from each other, no dating, you just got to wait till you get married. You know, all of that stuff is for married couples, which is true. All of that stuff is for married couples. That's not for you teenagers now. But because of the bondage and legalism that Hobart Freeman was in himself, that he taught to the other ministers, they could not help but communicate that same message to all of these people. And so let's just pretend you are a 17-year-old boy, and without being graphic, you just have hormones. And there's a cute girl in the church. What are you supposed to do about it? I mean, they were in a no-win situation because A, they didn't have any good, balanced, kind, fatherly, welcoming teaching and advice. They didn't have that. But B, in its place, they had all of this legalism and all of this spooky stuff. They had this positive thinking and confession. You know, let's just deny those things even exist. Let's just deny that I'm having, you know, hormonal feelings right now. But I'm going to promise you this, it doesn't work. It's just like beating the daylights out of an 8-month-old child to get them to be quiet and stop crying. Guess what? It's not going to work. You know, it will not work. And trying to separate these teenagers in the way in which they did to almost get them to deny what they were feeling, pretend that it doesn't exist, make them feel guilty if they do feel anything, it is simply not going to work. There had to have been a more biblical and sane and adult way to talk about these things. And just to say no dating, and just to say the automobile is a mobile bedroom, and, you know, just to throw those things out there and not be able to have someone, and it didn't have to be Dr. Freeman, it could have been someone else closer to their age, someone who would be able to communicate with them. Those hormones that you're feeling, thank God you have them, because we wouldn't have a human race if you didn't have hormones. You know, someone to acknowledge and affirm you're totally normal. There's nothing wrong with you. But I promise you, because I know the way Hobart Freeman did everything, and I know the culture that it created, I promise you there were young men and young women, late teens, early 20s, basically trying to deny reality. That, hey, I'm a male, or hey, I'm a female. You know, basically trying to deny the reality of who they were. So afraid that if I acknowledge, like talk to my parents or talk to a male friend of mine, if you're a male or a female, say, you know, wow, whew, man, my hormones, I used to be 10 years old. Now I'm 17. Man, there's a big difference between those ages. And just be able to freely talk about it. I'm a big believer that if you can talk about things like that with people, you take away the guilt and the evil and just the mystique. When you're 17, John, you remember you have no experience. You have no knowledge. You have no experience. You're dumb as a wooden spoon about everything connected to that. And you're desperate for information. You're desperate for knowledge. And here you've got this 60-plus-year-old guy up front, Dr. Killjoy, who is years past his fathering children age. He's your grandfather up there. And you've already heard all of this other stuff from him where he's taking everything away from you. And now he's basically saying, you're not allowed to be a teenager. And I know he didn't say that in so many words, but this is what comes across. Those feelings, those hormones, whatever name you want to put on them, you need to crucify the flesh. You need to deny the flesh. You need to pray more, spend more time in the Bible. Instead of someone being able to communicate to them, you're at a pivotal time in your life. Those hormones are natural. They're actually all God-given. If you don't have these hormones, then you're going to bring an end to the human race, because we need those hormones so you can do what people do when they get married and produce children. And the way it was brought across, it just needed to be done in a way where people felt normal, where young men and young women felt normal, and where they just felt comfortable in their own skin. And there is a way to do that, and also bring with that the message of the New Testament that we need to abstain from fleshly lust, which war against the soul. We need to flee fornication. We need to avoid youthful lust. I mean, those are all good teachings in the Bible. They're there for a reason. God wants us to follow them so that our conscience isn't seared. But I just hope that our audience can understand that there just needed to be a much, much better balance in that whole area.
Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support. I said before that these cults have largely impacted mainstream Christianity. Not all, but we experienced various similarities in some of the churches we tried. And it took me a long time to grasp this. I had to study quite a bit. I actually had to dive into studying psychology a good bit. One of the most powerful tools of manipulation by a central figure of a cult is anything that you cannot control that everybody has. If they can turn you against that and make you think that they're the answer to it, everybody has it, and they've got this magic elixir themselves that they can sell to the people. The hormones being one of the biggest ones, right? Everybody, like you said, the human race would have died out. To this day, ingrained in the back of my head is that anytime your hormones are raging or anytime you see beauty, we were taught and manipulated to merge together beauty and lust. Anything that was beautiful, if you admire the beauty, you also were lusting. And so it fell into this weird category as as a human male, if you go to the store and you see a beautiful woman in the line in front of you, you're going to notice the beauty. You're a human male. You have hormones. That's the way it works. But we were so manipulated to think that was evil that I'm literally, I can remember this. I was literally becoming uncomfortable that there was a female in front of me in the line. And this wasn't something that ended. I mean, even after leaving, it took a long time for me to get all of that out of my head. And there are many, I'm not going to go too far with this, I don't want to, but there are many cases in which there are male members of these cults who get together and discuss the problems that they face with this sort of thing. And even among the groups, I've been actually part of that discussion. Even among the groups, they are manipulated so much that the groups are further supporting the notion in private that the cult leader is right, that if you have hormones and if you see something beautiful, you have sinned and Satan is getting into your head. So again, leaving the cult, we started to experience some of this to some extent in mainstream churches, but it wasn't until I can't remember what church this was at, but I sat down with some guy and he was explaining the difference between beauty and lust, which is a fascinating subject if you really want to study it. But he was from Europe, and he started explaining, in Europe, you go to Nude Beach, right? And he says, I grew up here, and if you take one of these Pentecostal cult-style people in their adolescence and put them there, they will just go nuts because they don't know how to conduct themselves. But any human male that grew up in that environment, it's nothing to them. They everybody has body parts. That's the way this is. And there's still an attraction. There's still a beauty, but it's a difference between beauty and lust. And he says the beauty, and he was explaining, he was a Christian minister, and he was explaining the problems of lust. And it is, there are Bible passages that talk about this, but also there's beauty, and there are Bible passages that are talking about admiring the beauty. And I got to thinking back of the way I was raised, and I can remember entire sermons preached about how Satan's Eden was filled with beauty because Satan loves beauty and God does not. And I grew up thinking this, and as I'm reading the Bible again and again and cleansing this out of my head, I'm starting to notice all these passages where God loves beauty. Well, otherwise he wouldn't have created such a beautiful world and beautiful people in it. So to get that out of your head after being manipulated, it's very, very difficult.
I didn't know how this part of our interview would even come across, John. So I'm really glad to hear that it resonates with you. You had the same experience in that group that you were a part of, which was not a faith assembly group. But you are so right. There is beauty. I was talking to someone on the phone this week, totally different subject. It had to do with music, and he said he was a musician, still is. He's down in Nashville right now, but he had just, I guess he had just found out about Faith Assembly. And at the same time, he had just had, 1,000 or two vinyl records printed. And he realized that this, because it is not a gospel tune or gospel music, it's evil. So he said, I threw them all in the fire and burned them all. But I've told people now it's one thing, there's music out there that's just every other word is a blasphemous word or a cuss word. I have no interest in hearing that. But there's beautiful music out there that's very romantic, that may have some great, the husband and wife may have some great connection to the tune or to the lyrics. But at Faith Assembly, that would have obviously been sin. So it's just like what you're saying. Anything that is not following the cult, following it to the letter, there's something wrong with it. I don't know if you or your audience has ever heard of the book I Kissed Dating Goodbye, but this was it was a New York Times bestseller, and it came out in the late 1990s by Joshua Harris. And it came out during a period of time in the evangelical church where there was a movement called the chastity movement, where boyfriend and girlfriend would wrap little finger around little finger and promise to have no relations with each other until they were married. So they wouldn't kiss, They wouldn't even kiss. They wouldn't date. They wouldn't hold hands. They really wouldn't do anything. And it was called the chastity movement. And so this came about long after Faith Assembly. But I think this just pops up down through church history of Christians trying to figure out, how do we handle this whole area? And we can't do it on a podcast, obviously, but it's a valid question. How do we handle this area? And what I would suggest is we need mature leadership in the church that can relate to the people of that age, teenagers and 20s, that can instruct them. And Hobart Freeman just wasn't somebody he could do that. He had already disqualified himself as an instructor of teens and early 20s with all of his other legalisms. But my point in mentioning this book, I Kiss Dating Goodbye, it's a really fascinating book. Not so much the book, it's where Joshua Harris is today. He was a part of that movement where, everything was kind of spooky and everything was legalistic and everything was forbidden. And, there's a lot of guilt involved in anything connected to hormones. And I would just recommend, not that someone read the book, but go and read what Joshua Harris has said about his own book, 25 years later. Unfortunately, the man and his wife ended up divorced. Unfortunately, Joshua Harris says, I'm no longer a Christian anymore. I don't want to have anything to do with Christianity. And it makes me sad to see that. But if you read what he has said about his own book that was a bestseller, he said it put people in all kinds of bondages. It just created expectations that weren't real. It put people in bondage. It made people feel guilty. And enough on that. People can read that for themselves. So then what do you do if you can't date? Well, you just claim a mate. That's what they were taught to do. We can't date, but we can get a mate by claiming one. So you just claim a mate. And whoa, my word. Oh, man. What does that lead to? I mean, dating someone, and we'll let everybody else figure out how to teach dating and how to understand that. But the purpose of dating, or you could call it courtship, if dating seems to be too modern and too American and too promiscuous of a phrase, whatever you want to call it, that's your opportunity to get to know this person and them to get to know you. And I think that is very important. So just to stay in your parents' basement and claim a mate, what does that entail? What does that mean? When are they going to appear at your doorstep? How does that happen? How does that actually transpire? So what they realized is, I need somebody like myself. So you're going to marry within the sect. Faith Assembly, the mother church, was big. You had a lot of prospective people out there to marry. So what was interesting is all of the little satellite groups, they would start, when you get to when you're 10 and 11 years old, it never crosses your mind. But when you're 15 and then when you're 21 and not married yet, and you're looking around your own little satellite group in New Mexico that has 5 members and 4 of them are over the age of 60, then you become very concerned. Well, what am I going to do about a spouse? That brought a lot of people to Faith Assembly. I'm talking to someone now, just really beloved brother in, let's just say in another country. And 3 of his siblings moved to Indiana to Faith Assembly, and all 3 married spouses there. And so if you couldn't get to Faith Assembly and you couldn't find someone in your own satellite group, then it created a lot of travel opportunities among the satellite groups. And so the group in Alabama would go visit the group in Michigan, and the group in Massachusetts, I'm thinking of groups, would go and visit the group in Virginia. And there were groups everywhere. And these young people are, looking for a potential mate. And I don't blame them. I mean, you want to get married, you're looking for a potential mate. And I don't blame the fact that you're looking for someone that has your thoughts and beliefs, because normally a Methodist marries a Methodist and a Catholic marries a Catholic. The statistics are, the closer you are in agreement over important matters, the better chance you're going to stay married. So I don't have any problem with that. The problem is whenever you're a cult member and you marry another cult member, now you have two cult members in one family instead of just one. Now, how are you ever going to get out of that if both of you are in? And what we've seen too many times is one person decides to leave and the other person is going to stay a Freemanite to the end. And it just has produced all kinds of problems. I can remember, however, a group in Minnesota. Some people in that, one of the families actually came on several occasions and heard me when I was teaching and pastoring a group in Minnesota. And I remember one of the little girls that they had. Fast forward 20-something years, that young lady is a young adult, and she couldn't find anybody evidently in her own group, so she came down to the Shelbyville, Kentucky group. And I remember this so well because I knew her as a little child in my church. And whenever I found out she had come to the Shelbyville, Kentucky, I picked up the and called her just to welcome her. You moved from another state. You've left mom and dad and you're down here. She did end up marrying somebody in that group, but the phone conversation was very telling to me. I was friendly. I'm an old guy compared to her, but I was just saying, welcome to the great state of Kentucky. I got the cold shoulder. Oh boy, I could not even get a comment out of her. I got the cold shoulder, and I was trying to be friendly and neighborly. But I think the reason I probably got the cold shoulder is because they knew I wasn't a Freemanite. I was one of these guys wandering around on the outside. And I know later that same family in Minnesota, two of their daughters moved to Shelbyville, Kentucky, and married two brothers in one of the main families in that church. So that's just the way you do it. You don't date, you claim a mate. You make the satellite circles, or you head back to the mothership at Faith Assembly, and you're looking for a spouse there. Can we dare move to my next point here, John? Oh my, it only gets worse as we go along here. So now we're married. I don't know how we got married, because we can't have any feelings, no hormones, no dating. So we claim a mate, and somehow God delivers one. Okay, now we're married. And now married couples do things. However, there is a pastor up front in the pulpit who is Dr. Killjoy. And so on many occasions, and it would come out in this deeper discernment and deliverance series, which I'm telling you is, I call it psychobabble, mumbo jumbo nonsense is what it is. But it came out, and once he said it one time, then he felt comfortable saying it, repeatedly, and then it became part of church doctrine. And that was a prohibition against any marital foreplay. I'm not going to say any more terminology wise, but can you put yourself in the position, because I have done this, as I heard these things, I just thought, no, I never taught anything like this at all. No, don't be saying that. Can you imagine this 24-year-old young man who's just married a 22-year-old young woman? They're at Faith Assembly. You don't know diddly squat about the birds and bees at that time. And now your pastor has just stood up there and said, no foreplay. And they probably knew what foreplay was, but the reason that no foreplay was allowed is it might incite lust. This is your spouse you're married to. You better have some kind of something going on. I mean, for goodness sake, this is your wife. She's your wife. But they just want to prohibit and put boundaries and hedges and walls around everything. You know, John, after this was way back when you and I first started doing podcasts together, I'm going to say it was the very first phone call I got from someone who had been a member at Faith Assembly. They live in another state now, happily married to the same woman, and they have a good life. He had been a part of Faith Assembly. He was in, let's just say, the construction world, so that he actually worked in homes of some of the tier one ministers there. But as soon as he got me on the phone, it was just hilarious. He said, Chino, he said, I just, every now and then, he's one of these people who said, every now and then, I'll just Google Faith Assembly in Hobart Freeman to see if there's anything new. And he said, lo and behold, I couldn't believe that you and John Collins had just started doing podcasts. And I mean, we had only done 1 or 2 or 3, John. It was early on. And he tracked me down, picked up the phone, and called me. And these people have 40 to 45 years of stuff locked up inside. Just stuff. I had someone I talked to the other day said, I've wanted to talk to someone for 40 years. I've tried to talk to my other Christian friends about it. And they look at me like, are you nuts? Were you a cult member or what were you? You can't even talk about this stuff because nobody, unless you've been a part of it, can even understand this foolishness that you and I keep talking about all the time. A normal person goes, what in the world are you talking about? But he said, when Hobart started preaching those sermons about no foreplay, it might incite lust, he said, I'm a married man, 20 or 30 years old or however old he was at the time. He said, what am I supposed to do with that? He said, I can't really talk to my wife about it because what if she thinks that I'm wanting to rebel against the pastor and no foreplay? Who do I even talk to about it? So he said, I had some really good Christian brothers. We were all part of the same church. And he said, we weren't going to let anybody know about it, but we were going to talk about it. And so he said, so I asked my friends without being explicit, he said, does that mean I cannot even touch my wife? I mean, what does that mean? It's one thing to stand up there as this almighty mouthpiece of God and say no foreplay, it might incite lust. What do you mean by that? You got to give the people something. They had no idea how to deal with that, except somehow anything closely related to marital relations, to sex and marriage, somehow it must be dirty. Somehow it must be unclean. Somehow it must be wrong. And I really do think, based on all these things I'm saying came from Dr. Freeman's ministry, there was something not right in Hobart's mind about this whole business. There was something not right in his mind. And so he's laying all of his fears and bondages in the laps of the people. And just what a terrible thing it was. We've got a 60-plus-year-old grumpy old man with no professional training in marriage counseling and sex therapy, no social skills, no interpersonal skills, a hermit who'd rather live alone than ever see anybody. And you're going to let him be the authority on child rearing and dating and what happens behind closed doors in a marriage? I don't think so.
I really don't want to go too far with this one, but it does impact a marriage, and it really messes things up for some men, even mechanically. And I'm not going to go too far with that at all, but if you take away some of the elements of fun, mechanically, there are things that just don't work in some men. So there's that problem, but then there's also the psychological problems that this creates for the men. And it's unbelievable. And I'm not going to go too far with this story either, but one of the men that I know on their wedding night surprised the wife by saying, now what we're about to do is purely evil. It's of the devil, but we do it because we're in this world. So let's get down and pray before we do this thing we're about to do on our wedding night. And think of it's funny. And if you've never been in this and you hear that, you're probably laughing like crazy right now. But if you have been in this, you understand the depth of that, it just impacts every aspect of your marriage, of your life. It causes, there are studies, you can go look them up, and I'm not going to go too deep with this either, but there are studies on the way in which these types of religions warp the minds of the men who are raised in them, because they've been taught to be a different type of human than the one that actually exists. They've been taught that their hormones are evil, that the natural acts of recreation are evil, that the thoughts of it are purely evil. You can't even think about it. And it just messes with your mind. And there are studies on this. There are psychological profiles of people who get into trouble because of this. And I look back, and for my children, I'm just so glad that I got them out of this before they could get to that level.
Yeah, so true, John. There's just so much trauma that everybody experienced. My wife and I are funny about all these things. Funny in the sense that just everything is cool. We'll be driving down the road, and I'll see her turn her head, and I'll say, "What were you looking at?" She said, "That guy was a really handsome man." And, we just laugh over it because I'm the same way. I'll say, "Wow, that woman is just gorgeous." That doesn't mean I want to do anything about it. It just means that is a very beautiful woman. But you have to have some kind of maturity in your relationship and no insecurity. And that's all this stuff that Hobart taught could possibly have produced, John, in everybody, in every form and fashion, is insecurity. And you're just way, way, way out of balance whenever you live your life that way. One last thing, because we have to cover this to wrap it all up, since we're talking about male-female relationships, and that is the subject of birth control. You go back years ago to the Glory Barn, and you've got a young couple, and they get married, and they're all excited, and they say, "Let's have a baby," and they have a baby. And then they have another one, and then they have a third one. They have 3 wonderful, beautiful children. And around this time, 2 things are happening. One, you're noticing, just looking around you, that everybody else is having a lot of children. And then 2, you hear from the pulpit that if you try to prevent these arrows from coming into your quiver, if you try to prevent these blessings, then that would be sin. And so here comes down the pipeline, no birth control. And it only makes sense that this is just going to be a part of this whole business. So here, let me just read. This is handwritten part of Hobart Freeman's sermon notes whenever he dealt with his subject. And see if it doesn't make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. If men and or women have ever used birth control methods and devices, this was an opening for Satan's control over the female reproductive organs. And even though no birth control methods are being used now, deeper deliverance is required from these birth control spirits. Even though a woman has conceived and born, in parentheses, delivered, a living, or in parentheses, a dead child, her reproductive organs are still under Satan's control, if not only repented of, but delivered from. That could be the cause for deaths of babies because of the use of birth control previously, if not totally delivered from, gives Satan the right to take the life of the baby. So this was their hocus pocus view, that if you ever used not just the pill, but any kind of birth control method, he said device or method, then you have opened the door for invasion of evil spirits. Now, he was big on the pill. The pill, definitely, you're opening the door to evil spirits. But he just said any method or device. Hasn't God given women a natural method where they are fertile certain times of the month and certain times they aren't? That's birth control right there. And that's a natural form of birth control. If God is against all birth control, a woman should be able to conceive pretty much all the time. But it's just not the way that it happened. After Freeman passed off the scene, there was another movement called the Quiverful movement. quiver full, have a full quiver of arrows from the book of Psalms that really affected the evangelical and the charismatic church world, not connected to Hobart at all. I'm just saying these are different issues, whether dating, whether any form of birth control, whether any kind of foreplay in marriage. These are not new things. People have thought about these, talked about them, and people have taught against them in the past. I'm just saying here at Faith Assembly was a minister and was a church that made a big deal about all of these things simply because he loved talking about divine order in the home. And his version of divine order versus disorder in the home included all of these things that we have discussed. But surely adult men and women, reasonable people, can look back on all this and say that ministers need to stay out of the bedrooms of married couples and their personal lives. Newly married, figuring each other out. It's hard enough, John, being newly married, figuring each other out physically, spiritually, emotionally. That doesn't just happen overnight. It's hard enough to figure each other out. It's hard enough to figure out the physical stuff in your marriage just between the two of you without having some 17th century monk knocking on the door of your bedroom, wanting to come in and tell you guys what you should and shouldn't do. It's just a very tragic part of the history of Faith Assembly.
You know, I said I was dreading this subject whenever we got into the last one, but you know, it's just so wrong. You could tell in the Branham movements by looking at the number of children, which family adhered to the birth control and who did not. And I can clearly remember every minister that was teaching against it. The way they did it was very insidious. They would say, no, now I'm not going to tell you whether it's right or wrong to do birth control, but we know how William Branham felt about that. And so you're going to essentially, your head's going to go, well, wait a minute, what did he think about that? And so people would go pore over his sermons and try to find his notes. And Branham himself was insidious, so he manipulated people in the same way without just coming out and saying it, because he would have a revolt if he were to start to do this. But the other insidious thing that they did, and this was playing in the back of my head as you were talking, it's a little uncomfortable. These ministers, whenever they would start preaching in this manipulative way, they would say, "It wasn't so from the beginning." And every single thing that they did not want you to do, they would go, "It wasn't so from the beginning." And we didn't have the critical thinking. I mean, what are we going to do, man? You sit there in the pew and he's saying this. Well, neither was your suit that you're wearing. Neither was your watch. Your watch wasn't so from the beginning. What aspect of your life can you apply this to, man? But they would say that, and they would get real slow with their words when they said it. And it was just a manipulation tool. And after having been manipulated for 37 years of my life, I can tell you that of those churches that I've mentioned that I went to, if I'm in a church and a minister starts just preaching on fire and then going, "But think about the things that I'm saying," and starts talking really slow like this, I'm going to get up at the moment he does it and I'm going to walk out. I've done it because I'm not going to let them toy with my head. And that's the way that they do it. And the problem is, it's not limited to the cults. So when people leave this thing and after they've been manipulated, they're really uncomfortable being manipulated again once they realize it. So they go to a new church and then they find the same things happening because there are bad actors in every church. Every church denomination, I should say. Every church denomination has bad actors and good ones. But if you experience a bad one, you're going to think, oh, well, this is how Christianity is. All of it's like this. They're all manipulating me. And then those bad actors cause a person who has been manipulated all their life to suddenly just throw it all away. And I'm here to tell you that if you try several different churches, you're going to very quickly find out which ones are manipulating you and which ones are not. And after you experience some where they're not, you look at those ones that you went to that were manipulating your head, and you're thinking, what's wrong with them? Why were they doing that? If I'm having a conversation with you, Chino, and we're in the car and we're driving along and I'm wanting to impress my opinion on you, and I get real slow and I talk like this, you're going to look at me like, what's wrong with you, John? Are you drunk? But that's what they do from behind the pulpit, man. So, like I said, I'm glad I got my children out of this. I'm glad they don't. This subject is so weird to me that we're even having to, as adults, we're having to have this conversation about sex. Yeah, I can't believe we're doing this, but that's the way it was in these cults, man. So I'm glad my children wasn't in it, and I'm glad that you took the majority of the subject and ran with it, because I don't know that I could have done it.
Well, just thanks for giving me the opportunity, John. I wanted to do it in a way that definitely is G-rated, and it probably will put some smiles on people's faces out there, but it'll also show them the reality of it, and they can probably think back early in their life and remember some trauma, probably some hard discussions between husband and wife after hearing one of these messages, like, where does that leave us, or what do we do? It's all a reality. But I didn't want to, spend months and months on this. Let's sum it all up and move on from here. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you did.